Okay, I'm going to continue with this article. You can see the title of it. I don't have to say it again. So first, white heteropatriarchy, that is power as it is raced, classed, and gendered, inverts process. The preferential treatment white, male, and elite prosecutors conferred upon Epstein epitomizes the ability of white heteropatriarchy to invert the criminal legal system for the favored, where villains become victims, victims become villains. The Old Boy Network sweeps the crimes of network members under the carpet. And re-victimizes sexualized violence casualties, much like cases involving police officer shootings of the societally vulnerable, such as Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Eric Garner. The criminal legal process, specifically the prosecutors and law enforcement investigators, vilified the victims and liberated the perpetrators. Rather than expose Epstein to a life sentence, Acosta and other prosecutors colluded with Epstein's defense team to create a wall of silence, presenting a narrative about child prostitutes rather than child. Victim blaming is particularly effective in both Epstein and police shooting cases because it renders the pathology of the perpetrator invisible by removing accountability from the perpetrator and shifting blame onto the victim. Furthermore, this absence of accountability licensed Epstein's sexualized violence with impunity and enabled him to continue violating children. Like failed adjudications involving police shootings of the societally vulnerable, the failure to prosecute Epstein and the prosecutor's collusion with Epstein's defense attorneys enacted the same task as the violence itself: the exploitation and vilification of the victim, the overvalorization or hypervalorization of the assailants, and the reassurance of white heteropatriarchal order, entitlement, and preeminence. As Professor India Thusi incisively argues, critiques of excessive incarceration often focus on the race of the incarcerated, paying little, if any, attention to the roles of whiteness and white supremacy as the underlying logics and norms that drive much of the bias in the system. In Epstein, it was enmeshed with white heteropatriarchy of the suspect, defense attorneys, and the prosecutors that dictated the outcome, namely the embodiment of all facilitated exoneration. Long before law enforcement discovered scores of Epstein's child victims, Epstein's race, class, and gender, his white heteropatriarchal privilege, prompted the federal government to recognize his perceived overriding innocence and decline prosecution. His embodiment preceded the evidence. Moreover, Epstein's body prescribed his humanity, while his victims, often poor and female, lacked humanity and received no process. The preferential treatment Epstein received reflected a value judgment between himself and his victims. Judgment, therefore, represents the relative value of the suspect and his victims. Here, a white heteropatriarch trumping vulnerable child victims of sexual violence. This article adds to existing criminal legal scholarship by heeding Thusi's clarion call to probe not only white supremacy as a normal process, but it deploys an intersectional lens of white heteropatriarchy to map the race, class, and gender norms that drive the bias in prosecutorial decision-making. Sorry about that. This piece attempts to make known and knowable the obfuscated norm of whiteness and white heteropatriarchy as facilitators in racially disparate outcomes in federal sex trafficking prosecutions. Second, Epstein demonstrates the ways in which prosecutors distribute premature death in vulnerable communities and life and liberty for the elite. The conduct of prosecutors in Epstein reveals their active participation in the social construction of white supremacy, white heteropatriarchy, white innocence, and black demonry. Exonerating Epstein constructs white male ruling class innocence in the same way that hyperincarceration constructs black guilt. Both are sides of the same hegemonic coin. The Epstein dramatically illustrates that white heteropatriarchy is the result of both individual decision-making and structural dynamics within the criminal legal process. When Acosta abdicated his role as a state functionary and allowed Epstein's defense attorneys to dictate the terms of Epstein's freedom, Acosta surrendered the power of the state to private parties to protect a recidivist child rapist. The failure to prosecute Epstein further illustrates how the state becomes a weaponized ideological form of death. The ideology is white heteropatriarchy. Prosecutors materialize the white heteropatriarchy through their charging decisions, plea bargaining, and sentencing dynamics. The end result is freedom for the white heteropatriarchs and death and destruction for the racialized other. Finally, this two-tiered system of criminal justice, life for the powerful and death for and destruction for the vulnerable, solidifies calls for abolition. Juxtaposing Epstein with rates of hyperincarceration makes abolitionism neither hyperbolic nor hysterical, but rather a measured and reasonable response to a criminal justice system that targets vulnerable communities for cultural trauma and secures freedom for the powerful. As Thusi sagely observes, the system is highly flawed at best and perhaps rotten to the core at worst, rendering efforts at reform futile. Epstein presents a case study in abolition. This article proceeds in 4 parts. Part 1 sets forth the facts of Epstein, more specifically the overwhelming evidence against him. Part 2 sets forth the legal arguments and methods that federal prosecutors could have used to charge him with federal sex trafficking, had there been a will to prosecute him. Part 1 and 2 jointly make the case for successfully charging him federally. Part 3 historically contextualizes the failure to prosecute him in an era of mass incarceration and the simultaneous under-prosecution of sexualized violence. Part 3 also introduces white heteropatriarchy as the theoretical lens to grasp fully the failure to prosecute Epstein, as well as the role of white heteropatriarchy in constructing race in the criminal legal process. Finally, Part 4 argues that this two-tiered system of process facilitates demands for abolition. Short of massive overhaul of the criminal legal process, however, transparency and prosecutorial decision-making, along with bias training, are at a bare minimum fundamentally necessary to curtail the trappings of white heteropatriarchy as operative norms in the prosecutorial function. Before proceeding further, I want to underscore several points. I write not just as a sex trafficking scholar, but as a former federal prosecutor who specialized in large-scale federal sex trafficking prosecutions. I know the Department of Justice is a class act juggernaut of indictments, convictions, and sentencing when there is a will to prosecute. Parts 1 and 2 exhaustively explore litigation strategies and theories that could have been used against Epstein, and yet Epstein exemplifies the reason for the Me Too movement. As a journalist, Julie K. Brown and Professor Marcy Hamilton have argued, Epstein, like Harvey Weinstein, is not a story about individual bad actors. Instead, it's a story about the complicity of the criminal legal process in facilitating grape culture through prosecutorial collusion, victim blaming, and the refusal to recognize the humanity of victims. It is a story about how white heteropatriarchy creates racialized, classed, and gendered hierarchies that result in disparate material realities. Greater public awareness about a larger problem of under-prosecuted sex crimes is what Thusi calls the pathology of prosecutors, are all long overdue. Hamilton has argued that what Acosta and other prosecutors did mirrors what powerful religious institutions have done to protect pedophiles in their midst, namely silence the victims and protect the offenders. As Hamilton argues, the orchestration of power by men is only protected as long as everybody agrees to keep it secret. This is a story the world needs to hear. So the next part is part 1, facts of the Epstein case. Now, I'm not sure how much of this they're going to let me do on TikTok, but I will upload these videos to my YouTube channel at Finister76, or at all caps, I am woke AF. Thank you for caring, listening, paying attention, and understanding.